We had the joy of having lunch, my wife and I, with Brother Gibbs and Karen, his dear wife. And I just sat there and I kept looking at both of them, and I'd look at Karen. She hasn't changed at all. I don't think either one of them changed in 20 years they've been married as far as their appearance. And I kept thinking of you and college young people and high school young people. And of course, many college young people are going to be coming in this week. Some are here, but many will be coming in. You want to marry right. And so you want to date right. And this semester, like every semester, some will date the wrong person and engage to the wrong person and marry. I'm not trying to talk anybody out of engagement. But boy, if it's not the right person, get out of that relationship. It has to be the right one. I kept looking at Karen at lunch, and Mrs. Gibbs, I remember her going off to college and then graduating and no marriage in sight. Oh, there are fellas. I mean, she could have dated anybody she wanted and just started teaching for us and waiting and waiting and waiting. And, you know, looked hopeless. And she was not an old maid, please. Just didn't look like there was anybody in line. And there was a man that had completed his college and was over at Duke University, the head of the class in the law department. And he was graduating. And God put them together. God did that. And I wish, whether it's dating or whether it's a different job or whether it's a different area, I wish we'd just wait on God. And I can tell you from experience, the older I become in life, I'm not in a hurry just to jump. I want to do things by faith and believe God. We're going to do that. But a lot of times we could just slow down. So, man, if I miss this opportunity, might be the best thing you missed. Wonderful. Believe God. Trust God. I love Brother Gibbs. He's been such a dear friend. You know, his dad's been this way. We'd call him, he'd answer. And you have been there for us these last 20 years. We'll call, and he will answer us immediately. And he helps us. I think you'd be amazed how many times we, in a week's time, have to have legal defense around here. And this man has been raised up of God to help us. I want to thank you for that message. If you're watching online, you must hear it. Brother Gibbs, you come and preach. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Pastor. And thank you. What a joy to be here. And let me, again, thank you for all your kindness to Karen and me. And I am very glad Karen did wait because that worked out to my benefit. And I often tell people, when you get married, you have a choice. And fellas, listen carefully. You can marry up or you can marry down. And I always recommend you marry up. It spills into nicer children. Okay? There. And for those of you that are a little less familiar with our family, we had a 3-year-old little girl, Heather, and then we had a 1-year-old little girl, Heidi. And then we were blessed with twins, David and Danielle. 4 kids, ages 3 and under. How many think that house was hopping for a while, all right? And we, with our litigation, lived a bunch of the year in a motorhome and traveled around. They're older now. Heather's 18, Heidi's 16. The twins are 14. But sometimes kids say funny things. Danielle was about 5. She was riding with her mother in the car. And she goes, "Mommy, I've only got one mommy, but I've got 2 daddies." And for just a moment, this comment bothered my wife a little bit. Trying to figure out what the little girl was referring to. Well, she was referring to her heavenly Father. But here's how she said it. She said, "Mommy, I've got a heavenly Father and I've got a homely father." Well, as Danielle's homely father, it is certainly a joy to be here with you tonight. Matthew chapter 7. I've enjoyed all the music, but what a beautiful song about Jesus. And you know, I have the privilege of opening the Word of God in different churches, and I always like to go to preaching or teaching that Jesus himself gave. How many understand Jesus would generally get it right? He's the Son of God. And here he was, made man, living among us. And as he would teach and give instruction to his disciples, you may have a red letter Bible where you can see these are the actual words of Jesus. But if you look to Matthew chapter 7, he kind of comes to a conclusion. Beginning at verse 24, he talks about a wise man and a foolish man. Now, before we read the verses, I think we'd all agree that in the eyes of Jesus, in the eyes of God, we would prefer to be wise as opposed to be foolish. That anybody that says, I want God to say, there goes a fool, well, we'd clearly say, no, I want God to be well pleased. I want God to say, well done. And notice what Jesus teaches here, beginning in verse 24. He says, therefore, having referred to all he had preached previously, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house. And some good news here, it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. Then in verse 26, you'll notice the transition, the alternative that Jesus provides. He says, everyone that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Kind of interesting. If you look at these men, the wise man and the foolish man looked very much the same for a long period of time. You could say they had the same goals. The wise man and the foolish man wanted a house. They wanted a place to live. They wanted something they could use. They wanted something that could meet their needs. They wanted something that would last. They probably hoped to impress others with what they built. But the difference between the wise man and the foolish man would not have been seen in their goals. They basically had the identical goals. The wise man and the foolish man, kind of interesting in the scripture here, had the same teacher. They had both sat under Jesus. They had both learned from Jesus. Jesus had taught them and had lectured them, had preached to them, had shared his heart with them. And just because they were, if you will, in the same church, the same congregation, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You could even say the wise man and the foolish man had the same passion within their heart. They were both dedicated to building this house, and they wanted to accomplish this goal. This is what was important to them. But until the storm came, you couldn't tell the difference between the two. Until there was something that demonstrated there was a difference in the foundation. And you know, as you think about the foolish man, he probably, by not putting so much money into the foundation, might have even had a little nicer house. Because he'd have had more money on the top to do things that might look glitzier and might even look like he's accomplishing more. It might have been a little bigger. It might have been a little grander. It might have been something that, as you would just drive by, you'd say, wow, that was pretty smart. He put that thing on the sand, and look what he was able to build. But when the storms come, how many understand it's the foundation that matters? 2004 was kind of a tough year in the state of Florida. You don't have much of this out in California, but how many have ever heard of a thing called a hurricane? And that particular year, Florida got hit with 4 of them. The first time since 1851, when they started recording hurricanes, that had ever happened in one state. Charlie was the first, and Charlie was a scary one. We actually lived at that time in Tampa Bay, which with Tampa and St. Petersburg and Clearwater would be a population much like San Francisco and Oakland, about 3 million people. We're in the direct line of that hurricane, and there was a great fear because they couldn't evacuate. There were too many elderly people, too many hospitals, too many places, and that storm, fortunately for the people and also at the hand of God, how many believe God's behind all the storms, steered a little south but was deadly. Everything it hit, it flattened with a fierceness as it kind of rolled through the center of the state. Boy, then Ivan came next, and it kind of hit up in the Panhandle, devastating destruction. And then came Francis. That one came in from the east and hit the Kennedy Space Center, broke through the buildings, took tiles off the shuttle, ripped off roofs. Anything that was weak was already down. And Florida had already had a bad year. And then the fourth storm came, Jean, 20 days later. Almost right behind the one that had just come before Francis. And while a lot had already been cleaned out, everything that had been damaged before, all the tarps that were on the roofs and all the things that were kind of in half structures and lean-tos, well, they were devastatingly hit by this storm as it made its way across. I was helping the Schindler family, and at that point there was kind of a breaking moment. They had had a lot of bad media. That was the case that had gotten a lot of national attention because of their daughter's life being in jeopardy. And an opportunity had come where Larry King, when he still had his hour-long program on CNN, said, if you come, I will give you and the Schindlers the full hour. And there won't be anybody on the other side. You can discuss your issues. You can explain your side. You can present your viewpoint. You can attempt to sway. And at that time, Mr. King would have probably had an audience of 4 to 5 million pretty regularly. And then a lot of peripheral media would pick up on it. And so it was a good opportunity. But Monday, September 27th, we were scheduled to go live in Los Angeles as the storm devastated through Florida that Sunday. As the storm hit, all the churches had to abandon services. The roads were closed. There was an absolute mandate that if you went out, you were on your own. That the police would not respond, that there was no way for them to deal with all the emergencies. And so there were lots of warnings. Just stay put, ride out the storm. And Florida was getting to be a little storm weary at this point, with this now being the fourth, and the emergency management and the funding and all of that had largely expired from the taxing toll these storms had taken. I began to get phone calls Sunday afternoon from Larry King's people saying, can you get to Los Angeles? And I said, well, it's going to be a little tough. Every airport is shut down. And so they said, well, we will take this over. And as they went through the process, they said, every airport in Florida is now closed. And it's anticipated will be closed for 48 hours or so while they clean up the debris and begin operations probably Tuesday. They checked with Atlanta. Atlanta had diverted and closed. And essentially, there was no way to get there. And so they continued working, and they said, well, we've made a special arrangement if you're willing to try and do it. I said, what's that? They said, there's an international flight that's coming in from somewhere in Europe, and they said it's going to land in Miami. And it's not designed to take any passengers, but they said, we have contacted them. We have a relationship with the carrier. They're one of our sponsors, and they will allow the plane to stop, get fuel, and if you can get to Miami, you can get on the plane and come. And so we thought about it a little bit, and we made the decision that we should try. Now, I'll be candid. I don't know if this is one of the smarter decisions I made in my life. But we went ahead and made the determination that we were going to go into the storm. Now, for those of you that are geographically a little less understanding of Florida, Miami is 250 miles away from where we were. And so what we had to do was, I made a few thoughts. I contacted my grandfather. He was still living at this point, and he had one of those big four-door Cadillacs. And how many understand old guys like big Cadillacs? And so I figured, well, if you're going to go down in a big ship. And then I called one of the attorneys that worked with us who was single. And I figured if we're going to kill somebody, at least he won't have a family that'll be real upset. No wife and children. And then I called Bob and Mary Schindler. And I said, are you willing to go? And they said, yeah, we'll do this for our daughter. This is an opportunity. We were set to appear before the court. The Supreme Court was involved. And they said, let's do this. You know, as we ventured out into the storm, there's no fuel, so you're pretty much on your own. There's no stopping for anything. There's no help. All the lights are out. There's no food. And we began making our way down, and we were in kind of the eye or the back part of it where it calmed down a little bit, but you'd be rolling along, and then kind of like a 50, 60 mile an hour gust hits the car and makes you jump a little bit. And as we began venturing, it was kind of spooky because you were really very much alone. I mean, there wasn't any, you could see abandoned things, trucks that had been just left that were twirled around from the damage of the storm. You could see houses that had been damaged before, re-damaged. You could still see the damage from Charlie. We made our way down 75, and then we cut across. 75 does a bend at the bottom of the state through the Everglades. And going through the Everglades, you could again see the devastation of the storm as animals that generally would not have been scattered across the road had been dislodged. Gators had been moved. Birds had been knocked out. You could see the havoc that the storm had wrecked. Larry King's people had said, if you get to Miami, we will put you up at this very nice hotel, I presume 4 or 5 stars, very fancy. You can sleep for a few hours and connect up with this plane when it lands. Well, we showed up at the hotel, and Miami had no power. So the entire hotel is dark. There's no hot water. There's no room, the keys. They had all the doors just kind of ajar. And as I sat there for just a couple hours before we would board that plane to Los Angeles, I thought about storms. I thought about the damage and what had been done. And, you know, storms have a way of letting you see how things are really built. I mean, because if there had been contractors that had cut corners, you would have never known until the storm hit. You know, storms kind of have a way of refocusing your priorities. I mean, when you're in Miami, a town that would have had millions of people and freeways that would have been clogged, and you're walking through an airport terminal that's empty. You're escorted by one guard to a plane. There's no wait. There's no security. And you fly out and you look out at a city where the roads are just cleared, and all of a sudden people start rethinking what's important after they've weathered the storm. Storms also have a way of strengthening you for the future. You figure out, boy, how are we going to withstand these kind of things? How are we going to weather what we've been through? And that's what Jesus did as he paralleled storms and buildings at the end of his sermon. To most people, the foolish man might have even looked a little smarter until the storm came. You don't really see, you don't really appreciate the foundation until the storm comes. Now, let's ask ourselves 3 questions as we look at this passage tonight. What are the homes that Jesus was talking about here? the wise man building a house, the foolish man? What are the storms he was talking about? And how can you and I build our lives where we can withstand these storms? Well, I think you can see that the house here can certainly represent your life. The house can certainly be you as an individual. The house can certainly be you as a Christian, you as somebody that wants to make a difference. But I would also tell you the house could be your family. You read the scriptures, it'll talk about the house of David or the house of Saul. And it could certainly be your family, the foundation that you're laying for your children, your grandchildren, for future generations. You know, the house could be the nation of America. Because it can include, if you will, they would refer to the house of Israel or the house of, and referring to a whole community or a whole nation. And what God is saying is, if you want to succeed as an individual, if you want to succeed as a family, if you want to succeed as a nation, it's imperative that you build on the right foundation. We're in a society right now that says evolution is the foundation that we want to build on. And how many understand that's sand that doesn't withstand the storm? There's people that say secular humanism is the foundation. I am my own God. I'll decide who lives or dies. It's a choice if I want to end my pregnancy. It's a choice if I don't want to care for an adult or a disabled person. It's my choice, and that's a foundation you can build on. Materialism, another foundation you can build on. Greed, selfishness, it's all about me. And you know what? That person could be sitting in the church and look just like everybody else. Because you can't tell the difference until the storm comes as to what foundation you're built on. Now, the storms, I think you've got that figured out, can really be anything that comes into your life that could be unexpected. Living through a hurricane, you've had earthquakes. There can be natural disasters that occur. That's a storm. But there can also be circumstances. The death of a loved one. I think of my secretary, Jane Kelly. She was a pastor's wife, wonderful church, the Curtis Corner Baptist Church up in Rhode Island. And they had graduated from Bible college and gone there, and they had been there for 20 years. And they had pastored, and he had led that church, and she'd served as his wife. And he said, honey, I just feel led. I have military in my background, and I want to go help. There's some missionaries, and I want to get the First Baptist Church going that we're aware of over in Iraq. And some of you may have heard the testimony, but very sadly, as he was over there doing this very dangerous mission work, his life was taken. They murdered him just for wanting to share the gospel and help. Well, Mrs. Kelly went through a storm. There was a situation that she didn't anticipate, didn't expect. And it's in those moments that you see the foundation. You look at Newtown, Connecticut, the tragedy up there. It so gripped our airwaves, so gripped the heart and soul of our nation as they look at these young lives right ahead of Christmas and families being alone. And they catch themselves in that storm. And it's at those moments that the foundation is the absolute key. The foundation is the one that lets you know how you're going to respond. The foundation is the one that shows you the strength of your building. But then there's one more storm that we all face. How many understand the final storm is the one of death, where we step into eternity? And at that point, Jesus had been preaching. You can look, if you want, at Matthew 25:21. And he had been giving them the challenge that when you stand before God, you're going to hear one of two things. Look at Matthew 25:21. His Lord said unto him, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I'll make thee ruler over many things. Or look at verse 26. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I have sowed not, and gather where I have not strewed. The ultimate storm will be when you stand before God himself. And he'll say, you built on the foundation that mattered to me. Now notice, being a hearer is not sufficient. If you look at the verse, God says, you've heard what I've taught. You've heard these sayings of mine. The question is, are you going to be a doer of what Jesus said to make the foundation in your life rock solid? Now, let me give you just a few foundation points that Jesus taught. Look, if you would, at Matthew 7, verse 15. We'll go backwards just a little bit into his sermon. Verse 15, he says, beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And I won't read all the verses, but can I give you point number 1? Be careful who you listen to. How many understand there's a lot of false teachers in the United States of America? I'm an attorney, and it's amazing the things that people will fall for. We've all been able to see on the internet hoaxes and scams. Somebody says, send me $1,000 and I'll release to you $10 trillion. How many understand that isn't going to happen? But you might be surprised how many people are just tempted. Oh boy, just what would I do with 10 trillion? And the number is just so exciting. But you know what? It can be people in a church. It can be preachers on TV. It can be commentators on TV. How many understand just because somebody has a radio show doesn't mean they're right? And you know what? Jesus said, be careful. There's a lot of con artists. There's a lot of fraud. There's people out there that won't tell you the truth. How many understand there are people in this country that will lie to you? I mean, people will call me, Mr. Gibbs, I need your help. Sure, how can I help you? I got fired from my job. Well, that doesn't sound good. What happened? Well, I was speaking for Jesus. Well, that sounds terrible. I mean, you have a right. You know, if you're a government worker, you got a constitutional right. If you're a civil worker, bigger company, you got a protected right under Title VII. You can't be fired for just talking about Jesus. And, you know, it could sound pretty good. Okay? Little trick. Ask to see things in writing. Did your boss hand you a paper when he fired you? Yes, he did. And does that paper say you were fired for talking about Jesus? No, it doesn't. It says I didn't do my job, and I showed up late, and I did this, and I smashed up the truck, and, you know, it says all these other things. But I know for a fact it was because I was talking about Jesus. How many understand looking at the papers can show you some stuff? How many understand when you hear from teachers, if it doesn't line up with the Word of God? Jesus said, be very, very careful when you build that foundation who you're going to listen to. There's folks out there that would want to tell you things that are not accurate. Notice what he says in verse 13. He says, you need to remember that there's only one way to heaven. Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat, because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life. And notice this little phrase, and few there be that find it. Jesus said, you know what, if you want to be built on the solid foundation, be careful who you listen to, but also remember there is a straight and narrow way. There is only one way that leads to heaven. That's countercultural in America. We're in a society right now that doesn't want to accept that there's only one way to heaven. We're in a society right now that wants to say there's lots of ways. You may have your way, I may have my way. But the reality is, Jesus says clearly, if you want to be built on the solid foundation, you need to recognize there is only one way. And that's through Jesus Christ. Now, we have cases, I kid comes to church and gets saved. And by the way, how many believe children ought to come to church and get saved? And how many appreciate the workers that help them get saved? And the kid does what we tell him to do. He goes home and tells his parents. He says, Mama, I just trusted Jesus. I'm going to heaven when I die. And the mother will say, well, I am too. And the little child says, no, you're not. And the mother says, what are you talking about? Of course I am. And the child says, no, 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 Mom. You got to trust Jesus. And you haven't done that. And they try to explain the plan of salvation. How many understand years ago parents understood when you sent your child to a Baptist church they'd hear about Jesus? How many understand today parents are pretty clueless? I mean, this is a babysitting or a pizza party or just a gathering or daycare. They don't quite have it. And all of a sudden these same parents will turn around and say, who told you that? And they become angry. They'll even sometimes go get lawyers and say, you've ruined my child. You've told him he's going to die and go to hell forever unless he becomes like you people. Now, we're winning those cases. How many are delighted we're winning them? But it's heartbreaking to even think that it would be brought. And Jesus says, you know, there's going to be pressure for you to embrace other options. But if you're going to anchor to the foundation, you've got to be careful who you listen to. And you've got to acknowledge that there is but one way, and few there be that find it. It's not always going to be the popular choice. Notice what he says, number 3 in verse 12. Kind of gives a version of what we call the golden rule. He says, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. If you want to build on that foundation, if you want to build on the rock, Jesus says, you know what? Be nice to other people. How many understand that's kind of the opposite of being selfish? You know, instead of saying, what's in it for me? Jesus said, no, no, no. The foundation, the real joy, the real success, the real difference, the one that's going to hear well done is going to be somebody that stays others focused. You know, the reason why we even have a Roe versus Wade, the reason why we even have to battle euthanasia, the reason why the sanctity of life is even an issue in this country is there's a lot of folks that say, you know what, that child or that senior adult or that handicapped or disabled person is too much trouble. I think I'm just going to build on the sand. It'll be quicker. It's what I want. It'll be better for me. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. You need to be others focused and think how you would want others to treat you. Look at verse 7. Jesus talking about himself as God. He said, ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there of you whom if his son ask bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he give him a servant? If then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father, which is in heaven, give good things to them that ask him? Point number 4, Jesus says, remember, God desires to give good gifts to his children. Can I ask you a question? What are you depending on in 2:13? You say, well, Mr. Gibbs, I'm depending on Washington. How many think that's a scary place to count on anything? We minister there. We reach out there. We want to be a blessing. We want to pray for them. We want to honor them appropriately. But how many understand the government is not God? Now, to a lot of Americans, the government has become God. We look to the government. We expect the government. We want the government to help us, to reach out, to do things. But God says, no, no, no. My people, those that are going to build on the foundation, are going to be looking to me. They're going to be dependent on me. Now, if you're dependent on him, you're not looking to another source, but how many understand you're also not depending on yourself? That includes your own opinion. How many understand we live in a society where everybody has an opinion? I mean, here's what I think. Well, in this situation, preacher, here's what you should do. Well, with your kid, here's what... And people have opinions, don't they? And you know what God says? It's not your opinion that's going to matter. It's what I've said in my word that controls. That's the foundation. Remember, as you depend on God, He wants to do good for you, but you've got to listen to what He says. Look at verse 1 quickly, Matthew 7. Simple little phrase. Judge not, that ye be not judged. I won't read the other verses, but could I challenge you, if you're going to build on that foundation, that you don't judge others by some inconsistent standard? How many understand sometimes when you get judgmental, you get awful prideful? Look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished. Look where I'm at. Now, please understand, you need to look to the Word of God. How many believe you ought to preach righteousness and holiness? But not live in that judgmental arrogance. You say, oh, but Mr. Gibbs, look at this individual. I mean, they're addicted to these substances, or look how they live, or look how they've hurt people. And all of a sudden, we get real quick to be judgmental, don't we? But not realizing the things that in your life are really all gifts from Him. You may not understand what that individual's gone through. You may not understand what they've experienced. And that doesn't justify sin. But what God is saying is, if you're going to be built on the foundation, the rock, if you're going to withstand the storms, if you're going to be able to take what life will throw at you, if you want to hear well done, don't judge by an inconsistent standard. Look at Matthew 6, verse 22. We're almost done. Jesus continuing there, talking about Matthew chapter 6, verse 22 to 29. I won't read it all. Let me just focus on verse 24. No man can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, which we know to be money. Jesus said, if you want to be built on the solid foundation, live free from materialism and anxiety. How many understand we're in a society right now where materialism is a huge deal? Everybody wants more. Everybody wants to expand. Everybody wants the next thing. But you know, there is a truth to all of that. How many have ever bought something and then wished you hadn't done it? You know, thinking about owning it was more fun than actually having it. You know, I mean, I've been talking to things. I've bought exercise equipment I never used. You know, it becomes a glorified pants holder. I mean, that's really all, you know. I mean, they made it look fun. You know, you're skiing or doing something or walking or whatever, and you get on it and you're like, that's a lot of hard work. You know, why did I do this to myself? And you know, sometimes the things we want, you know, you want that car and then it breaks down. The house, and then there's repairs. And you know what? That's all sand stuff. It's all going to burn as hay, wood, and stubble. I know you all have lived in a market out here. The houses went crazy. They crashed a little bit. They bounce around. And you know what? We all realize that stuff just all moves around. But if you live for that, you're just going to be up and down. And you're going to get bounced all around in the storms. And Jesus says, you know what? If you would live free from that materialism, if you'd live free from that anxiety, that worry, you're going to be on that solid foundation. Give you a final thought. Look at Matthew 6 and verse 1. Jesus here in the next couple of verses gives challenges to them to live righteous when no one is watching. Take heed that you don't do your alms before men to be seen of them. He then continues that don't have a trumpet. And then he talks about praying. Verse 4, thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. You know, if you're going to build on that foundation, if you're going to be on the rock, if you're going to be solid when the storms of life come your way, you got to be somebody that says, you know what, I'm going to live righteous when no one is watching. Now, let's just get real practical. That's the stuff that's on your cell phone. You say, oh, I just, it's no big deal. It's just, it's so handy. Well, God's saying, is it right? That's the stuff that's on your computer. That's the stuff that only you know. And God says, you know what, if you're going to be that foundation, if you're going to be able to withstand the storms, it's important that your life be such that you live righteous when no one is watching. Now, I'll be honest, I can't tell anybody here that isn't living righteous all by yourself, because guess what? You're the only person who does know. That's why our houses can all kind of look the same. That's why your house might even look better than somebody else's house, because you've been able to put on the facade, you've been able to show, you've been able to say, look what I've done. And yet then when the storms come, and all of a sudden there's nothing left, because you weren't built on the rock. You'd built it up on the sand. A friend of mine wanted to go over to the slums of Africa. He was a businessman. He paid for his own trip, and he hooked up with some missionaries there. And just to give you the short version, he was excited. He wanted to go. He was going to reach people with the gospel. He was going to go into these very, very poor areas. If you haven't been there, and I haven't personally, I've just heard them described, it's just abject poverty, miles of people, almost like in what would look like a trade show area. People get little 10 by 10 areas. That's where they live. That's where they sleep, eat, function. The amount of mess that gets created in there and how it's carried out, it's a stench, nasty area. Very poor people. And there's people that go in there to give the gospel. And as an American, he was excited to come over there and wanted to be a blessing to these people. And he was anxious to go. And the pastor said, oh, no, you're not ready. And he was a little offended. He said, what do you mean I'm not ready? I've prayed. I've raised money. I did this trip. I came. And I'm here. I want to minister. I want to soul win. I want to share Jesus with these people. Oh, no, you're not ready. So why? How are you so He's no, you're from America. You're not ready. He said, what do you mean? Well, your television has corrupted your mind. Your materialism has you messed up. You think differently. Would you give us just a little time to pray with you and to share with you and to let the Lord get you ready? They said, you're going to need a stronger foundation to go do what we do here each and every day. And my friend said, I was kind of offended. But as these dear men, some of them nationals, some of them missionaries, that had dedicated their lives to living in this abject squalor, began to pray and began to ask God to prepare me and to build me, he said, I realized a lot of what I'd done with my life was sitting on the sand. I wasn't ready for the storm of this ministry. I wasn't ready to go in. He said, we had a great time. He said, personally, I got to lead hundreds of people to Christ. He said, I got to preach and do ministry. It was phenomenal. But he said, the highlight of the trip for me was the 2 to 3 hours where the pastors prayed over me and helped build the foundation so I was ready to weather whatever storm God had for me as we ministered. Jesus is the rock-solid foundation. He's the foundation for the church. But here's my question. Is he the foundation for your life? Are you built on Jesus? You say, well, Mr. Gibbs, I think I am. That may not be enough. You want to know for sure. What about your family? You say, I'm hoping for the best. That's not going to be enough. Are you built on the rock? Our nation, we're heartsick. We see what's going on in our country. But, you know, till we get our lives, till we get our families on the rock, come and understand we're not going to get America back on the rock. The collapse of somebody else's house doesn't mean yours has to fall. You may see a preacher or somebody you hold in esteem and say, how did that happen? Oh, they did a lot, but it was on the stand. Great was the fall of it, Jesus said. It can be a mess. At that point, it can almost be embarrassing. But Jesus said, you know what? The difference between the wise and the foolish all comes down to the foundation. As you think about 2:13, as you think about the issues of our day, as you think about your family, as you think about decisions you'll make this week, are you building on the rock? Or are you living on the sand? Every head bowed, every eye closed.